Welcome to the Inspiring Social Entrepreneurs podcast. My name is Fergal Byrne. Every week, I talk to inspiring social entrepreneurs and changemakers dedicated to building a better world. Here, they tell their stories, the highs and the lows, and share what they have learned to help other social entrepreneurs and changemakers on their journey. I'm very pleased today to be speaking to Akshay Saxena. Akshay is co-founder and president of Avanti Learning Centres, which provide low-income high school students a world-class science and mathematics education in India. It is a radical approach to teaching, with no trained teachers and very little conventional lecturing, and yet students perform at a par with some of the most expensive after-school programs in the country. Avanti runs standalone centres in Mumbai, Delhi and Kanpur, and in-school centres at the Chennai Corporation schools. Hi Akshay, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to inspiring social entrepreneurs. Maybe the best place to start would be tell me a little bit about Avanti, where the idea came from and where you are today.
What Avanti does is we run science and math programs. So we teach physics, chemistry and math in high school, so grades 11 and 12. We work with about 1,500 kids across the country, both within the public school systems as well as in our own centers that are after school. The key innovation that we are trying to push through is a shift in how students learn from a model that's very, very centered around teachers lecturing in classrooms to one where students can do a bulk of their learning themselves, mostly through reading things on their own, working on problems themselves, but also, quite importantly, having a space and curricular structure for them to collaborate together and work together on problem sets. We found that by creating curriculum that's very specifically designed to learning this way, we are able to replace highly trained teachers in classrooms with coaches or people who aren't really trained in the subject but are trained in classroom management. So we've been able to disaggregate the two functions that teachers normally perform, one being the subject expertise and the other being managing the classroom well, inspiring kids. And by building a model where the subject expertise is essentially replaced by our content, we've been able to make this much, much cheaper. So our programs cost about a fourth of what our competition costs in the marketplace, and so far have matched or outperformed even the most premium programs in the country. I think what's starting to get quite exciting is the fact that we are now starting to both work within our own schools as well as work with school teachers during the school hours and really change how they teach rather than supplement their teaching, which is, I think, moving us towards really changing how education happens in classrooms at scale.
Wow, it's a very exciting project, very exciting what you're doing, and I suppose your goal is to enlarge, to increase access to this kind of training. So I suppose that for you need a certain amount of money to go into the traditional kind of tutoring services and so forth, which would exclude large swathes of the population, I suppose. So is there, in some sense, that your aim is to make this available to as many students as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the goal really has to be to change how teaching happens in schools to be more effective. I mean, the big reason why after-school teaching exists is because most classrooms are really quite ineffective at teaching these subjects. So what we really believe is, given that we can achieve fairly good results without subject experts, if we can really start to work with teachers in schools, we can significantly improve the quality of their instruction, thereby making after-school teaching rather redundant for most children. And if we can, a stat I'd like to just sort of quote, because it will give you context here, is, for instance, in Delhi, which is where I am based, there's about 200,000 children who are in grade 11, of which only about 10,000 are picking the sciences. And that's a shockingly low number in a country like India. And the biggest reason it is because most of these kids don't believe that they can get access to any reasonable form of instruction in the sciences. So, just by making it easier to learn science well, I think we'll really increase the number of kids moving towards the sciences and how they perform in them.
Wow, it's very, very, very exciting. I mean, I remember some time ago in INSEAD being part of a team looking at new learning techniques and approaches to learning, and visiting schools in America that were talking about collaboration and things. And this was 20 years ago. Ideas about collaborative teaching, I suppose, have been around for a long time. What is it that you have worked out, and what is it that you do that is different? You talked about changing the curriculum and so forth. I mean, this has been an aspiration, I suppose, for from many people within education. What have you learned about making it happen?
So I think our biggest innovation, I think it was driven more by necessity, was to not build this around a traditional teacher, right? Which is we because we could not hire science and math teachers, we had to make this program work with people who had often no science training running these classrooms. So when we pushed ourselves, into this down this path of saying, can I make a program that someone with a bachelor's degree in the arts, which allows someone with a bachelor's degree in arts to actually teach high school science and math. When I pushed myself to design that program, and we find that we can, and not only can we do that, that pairing of someone with no subject knowledge with our curriculum actually works just as well. I think that's really been the most remarkable thing that we found. That good teaching can actually be disaggregated from knowing the subject really, really well. So I believe that's really been one of the keys to us being able to do this, which is to not build this around the assumption that the person in the classroom knows a bunch.
Right. What does that actually literally mean? I mean, this is it implemented by software, and has the software been designed with certain specific ideas behind it?
No, it's not implemented with software. It's actually mostly implemented in pen and paper. So I'll give you a sense of how our classrooms run, right? So in a traditional classroom, if you were to study a topic, you'd kind of most students would come to the class more or less blank, right? There's obviously recommended reading, but most students won't do that. They come to class and someone spends about an hour and a half per topic lecturing them. And teachers tend to vary in how they run these lectures. Some of them will make them more collaborative or interactive, but most would kind of just lecture what's in the textbook at them. The way we run our classroom is firstly the students it's made amply clear to the students that there is no teacher in the classroom when they come in, which means that there is no real hope of anyone telling them anything if they don't prep and come to class. So they're expected to do a bunch of reading. They're also given some video content that they can choose to watch before coming to class. When they come to the classroom, we have segments of about 30 minutes, and these are roughly comprised of 20 minutes of individual work and about 10 minutes of group work. So, for instance, one of those exercises would just be a set of 5 or 6 questions that are carefully sort of designed so that the kids can attempt them first by themselves, and then spend another 10 minutes trying to solve them as a group. Another exercise we'd run would be this thing we call the concept test, where we would throw up a question on the screen. The students would all think about it individually, vote individually, then discuss it, and then vote again as a group, and then they're able to see how their thinking or understanding moved as a group. So similarly, there's these slots of about 30 minutes, and we'll do about 4 of them in during the course of the topic. To get the students to a minimum sort of level within their group. And then they go back home and they do a set of problem sets that again have video solutions available with them. So we spend all the classroom time kind of focused on them applying knowledge and sort of posing problems for themselves, so that they can do most of the knowledge gathering either pre-class or post-class, and we kind of use the classroom time focused on collaboration.
Right. That's very interesting. Does it entail, or does it require a certain level of motivation in terms of what the students bring to it, because they have to, I suppose, be motivated to do this work themselves?
I think it does to an extent. We work mostly with low-income students, or students who are not as economically privileged. Also, I think in India there's a cultural context behind education where I think people tend to value it very, very heavily in the middle class and lower middle class. So I do think our kids are on average very motivated to do well at this test. That's definitely true. Though I also think that part of it is habit forming, which is I think if students generally enjoy what they do in class, and if what's driving them is their desire to look good in front of their peers, I think that's often a stronger motivation to do pre-work than doing all of this in front of an authority figure.
Right.
So I think that's something we find works quite well in our favor. That the kids are, eventually going to come to class and have to, either, you know, look good in front of their friends or look horrible.
Yes.
And I think that's often a better motivator, as you know from from being in business school, than the authority figure. So that helps. But I do think our kids are on average quite motivated.
Right. That's interesting. And what is your vision for Avanti in 5 years' time?
So I really think that we need to I think that we need to get to close to about 1 million kids in 10 years. Um, and by 1 million students, I mean 1 million students learning in this way. So I think in the next 5 years, really, what we need to do is be able to templatize this a little bit more. I think we're still very young. We're still learning how to do this better. As you alluded to before, I think we need to build more systems around this. Turn much of our pen and paper processes into things that can be, implemented on computers, and then start to really scale, the pedagogy or scale the implementation of the pedagogy across the public schools and in our centers. So we hope in 10 years we can get to 1 million kids. Where we'll be in 5 years is that I don't really know yet.
Right. It's just the goal frame, time frame. You look at your goals. It's good. Yeah. I mean, do you call yourself a social entrepreneur? And what does it mean to you to be a social entrepreneur? What inspired you? Yeah.
Okay. So yes, so I think both my co-founder and I kind of started this work primarily because we wanted to make sure that more kids had access to the same opportunities that we had. Krishna and I both grew up fairly, middle class. And I think because there's such a small number of good colleges in India, and I think it goes hand in hand, and also because it's such a small number, the opportunities afforded to you if you manage to get into those colleges are pretty amazing. So, really, if we can broaden access to quality science education, I think we will be able to really allow many students access to the opportunity of significantly bettering their lives. I think it's, I don't get very excited by, families who are near the bottom of the pyramid seeing some incremental growth or earning, a wage, because that's not really that exciting. I think what's really exciting is if you can take someone with potential who's at close to the bottom of the pyramid and allow them in the course of one generation to really dramatically change the outcomes for themselves and their families. That for us is what's really exciting, and we feel that in the Indian context, sort of access to a good college education can do that for many children. So that's really what keeps us quite excited about doing this. And I think the other part of it is that what we are doing seems to be working, and because the implications of this working at scale are quite large, even just making that happen is quite exciting each day.
Well, sounds very exciting. What was I going to say there? I had something I wanted to say. What about the early days when you were getting the project off the ground? Things were presumably uncertain at certain times. I mean, what made you believe in its potential?
So I think we made quite a major pivot, I think, a year and a half into, or 2 years into Avanti's existence. When we started, we were primarily putting these kids into other after-school teaching programs. We were finding these children, putting them into other after-school programs, and our entire organization was kind of built on mentoring. So we were mentoring these kids. Only to realize in about a year's time that the mentoring in itself, when we were still getting not great education in the after school programs, was rather useless. So that was probably the narrative of Avanti's history, where we realized like our first version of Avanti didn't quite work. I think what kept us going was I think part of it is we had, and this is again all those the implications of being in education. We had a cohort of kids who had enrolled with us or who we were responsible for, and we felt it was kind of our natural responsibility to at least see them through. So that was important. But I think what kept us going was that I think inherently we just always believe that there has to be a solution to this, and we've always felt that we've been on the cusp of finding it. So I think it's a little bit of reckless optimism.
Yeah.
But I think that's the bulk of it. We've always kind of felt that we can sort of do this. So even when it's not been great, we've been able to plow through.
Yes. Do you see yourself as do you see yourself as disruptive entrepreneurs? I mean, do you think about the idea of disruption?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really exciting, right? Because I think more often we get a lot of most social entrepreneurs get told a lot of great things about trying to save the world. But I think in many ways, what's really exciting is disrupting existing structures, right? There's this well entrenched, and this is true of most of the world, very well entrenched industry really of education, and both in the private sector and in the public sector that refuses to change, continues to deliver really terrible outcomes, and does nothing new really on a macro level. So the ability to go wave results in people's faces that says, look, even when I ignore every single metric that you set as a standard for good education, a trained teacher, a large school, playgrounds and infrastructure investments, and I can still produce better outcomes than you. I think that's just exciting. The fact that a new model for education could look nothing like really what was happening before, and that we could play a role in ushering in what the new kinds of schools would really look like is very exciting.
Well, it sounds very exciting. I mean, to come back to this, what is the quintessence, do you think? I mean, because people have been looking at this question for years. There's lots of it's a big industry, isn't it? And there's lots of disruptive education this and disruptive education that. But it seems like you have a proven formula, something that you're doing that works powerfully. And how, in what way is that differentiated, would you say, from other approaches and other ways that other newcomers as well and startups are looking at this? Or is this something of an established, is there a group of companies, a wave that are working in the same way and a kind of established, about to be established or in the process of being established way of looking at this?
So I think the big difference, I believe, and this, I think, is my personal criticism of a lot of innovation education, right? I think there's two fundamental desires. One is people actually keep looking for a silver bullet, that technology will somehow come and magically solve, years of problems in education. I think, we found that the bulk of our positive outcomes are driven by relationships between our coaches and the students. And that the relationship between the person who's the authority figure or the guide or the mentor in the classroom and the child, I still believe is the single biggest driver of academic outcome. So we could have, significantly worse curriculum, we could have significantly less defined processes. But if we had good coaches and those coaches had good relationships with the students, we would still do well. But the reverse is not true. We could have the best system in the world, we could have adaptive testing, and we could have great curriculum. But if we could not create sort of a nurturing environment, one that had empathy, one that got the kids inspired, and that's built mostly by people in those centers, all of that would be useless. And I think that really, I believe, is the answer here, which is I don't think there is a technology solution to this problem. I don't think there's a people solution only. I think both will have to work together. But if I was forced to pick, I think the biggest one is the people part still. It's just that I think the people in the classrooms need to do different things.
That's possible.
And I think that's really where we've been able to be quite different, where we still believe the biggest part of what we do is done by people in the centers, and not so much by our curriculum.
Well, that's fascinating. So I suppose you've given quite a bit of consideration to the kind of aptitude, character of the people that are working in the classroom and hired people accordingly. I mean, what have you learned about the kind of person that's best able to do this, their skills and the kind of context in which they work?
1 second. I had to come to the kitchen. People are filling water, so I have to start talking. So I think the biggest attribute is really empathy. With these children, because I think when we look at who we hire, there's a bunch of parameters around their awareness of, of the prep that the kids are going to engage in, their ability to deal with, implement our processes and so on and so forth. But I think the biggest attribute is really their ability to empathize with children, form strong bonds with them, deal with, the stresses that come with working with teenagers. So in many ways, sort of empathy, I believe, is the single most deterministic, personal attribute for our facilitators or coaches.
Right. That's interesting. And what have been the biggest challenges then? What would you say are one or two of the biggest challenges you faced on the journey?
I think a couple. One is, I think, just in terms of what we do, it requires students to make a quite significant mindset shift from where they've been used to being taught things, even if ineffectively, to being responsible for their own learning. So I think, especially because we work still with relatively older children, bringing about that mindset shift, for the entire class continues to be a little bit challenging. It's getting easier with time as, we establish a reputation, and also, we'll be moving to lower grades in subsequent years. But that's been one big challenge. I think the other one has as with most startups, been people, which is, being able to hire fast enough, because there's a lot of demand for what we do. I think our biggest constraint is just being able to ramp our team up fast enough and get people trained to do this. And I think linked to that is the fact that, given I told you that the biggest attribute is empathy, it's very hard to train for empathy. So hiring is a big factor of success for us. And I think as we get better at potentially training for empathy, we'll find ourselves able to scale much more easily.
Right. A lot of social entrepreneurs I've talked to talk about the difficulties at the beginning, being alone, and even working with co-founders, but building a support network, building an advisory board, things like that seem to be, really important and really help chances of success. Can you tell me a little bit about what your experience was and how you went about that?
Yeah, I think we were very lucky in many ways. I think, starting right from the beginning, our first bunch of money came from Stanford. We won a business plan competition there, and Matt Flannery of Kiva, who's in my mind is one of the most successful social entrepreneurs I know, was my judge and ended up becoming one of my closest advisors. So I think we were very lucky to have Matt in the beginning. He knew nothing about education, but knew a lot about starting these kinds of businesses. So that was very useful. Along the way, we ended up through a bunch of the fellowships we won, meeting some great people. Our first investor was also someone we met through Echoing Green. So I think we were lucky in the sense that I think because we went through, I believe, a fairly traditional route of becoming social entrepreneurs, right, where we won some business plan competition, then we got selected into a bunch of fellowships. Access to people who were interested in what we did has never really been hard for us. So we've been fortunate, but I do think the one thing we've learned is there'll be many people who want to be advisors. I think it's very important to pick. Is to make sure that you pick a small number and make sure that your interactions with them are rich, as opposed to having an advisory board of 40 people you hardly ever talk to. So I think that's been something we've learned lessons around with time.
Right. It's interesting. Any other areas where you would have advise other entrepreneurs working in education or these kind of areas, or social entrepreneurs? A few things that you think are important. I mean, clearly you swim in these waters. You go to conferences, see social entrepreneurs around you. Are there a few things that, from your experience, that you would share and advise?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that have been big lessons for us. I think the first is to be, to really be okay with the fact that many of our businesses will grow a little slower than the conventional startup, right? And I think that's something which especially for those who are for-profit entrepreneurs, is something that's harder to get used to, because the problems you're solving are unstudied in many ways. In education, especially. Our product cycles are effectively years long. So it takes a little bit of time to gather traction and understand what you're doing. And it's important to be patient in our work. I think the other uh, is really to focus on finding, a good team early, because I think for us, much of our ability to get anything done has been, hinged upon our first few employees, who've come in, they've figured out how to do this, they've gone and hired the next tier of people or next lot of people, and I think if we hadn't done a good job of hiring our first few employees, I think we would have been in a very different place, at this point.
Right. And you mentioned Echoing Green, and there are more organisations today certainly around to support social entrepreneurs. Are there a few resources, books, organisations that you think are helpful for social entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think almost everyone we've been associated with, which is Echoing Green very early, the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation a little bit later, Ashoka. All three of them, I think, are incredible networks. They're all quite different from each other, but are very, very helpful from everything from, figuring out your governance to raising money to finding an advisory board to hiring people. I think that's been very, very useful. I think on the topic of social entrepreneurship, I don't have many books to recommend. Krishna does my co-founder does most of the reading of the two of us. But I think I do think the one important thing is that I do believe that it's important to recognize that much of what especially for those who are building for-profits, that we are building businesses. So I think it's important to read as much about running companies, or understand as much as possible about running companies as it is to understand social impact. And there's often a challenge of deprioritizing one in favor of the other, which we run. But that would be my advice would be to even if it in small capacities, get involved with the organizations that have large networks of social entrepreneurs, because much of the best learning I've had has come from other people who've done this before, and less so from people who are experts in the field. Right.
That's interesting. Oh gosh, it's just gone again. I was going to. You mentioned, you mentioned the question of profit and for profit and so forth, and it can be a tricky topic for some social entrepreneurs. It's quite a loaded idea, and how do you think about profit? How would you advise social entrepreneurs to best think about profit in the context of what they're doing?
I think I obsess about it. I think the most important thing to recognize is there is no free capital in the world if you're a for-profit, right? I think there's it's easy to get lulled into believing that there's very patient capital that doesn't really demand return, but much of that capital comes at the cost of equity, and you will end up not owning much of your company very quickly if your company doesn't make money. So I think it's very, very important to if one is to go down the for-profit route, then I think it's important to recognize that you are building a business first, and you will need to show healthy cash flows and the potential for making money if it is to succeed. I think the best check and balance on making sure that does not come at the cost of one's initial goal is to just make sure the product we're delivering continues to be one which has significant social gain, right? So I think it's a little easier to say that when you're an education company, because it's hard to design an education product that's harmful or not helpful if it works. But I think my view on this, and it might be a little extreme, is that if you are a for-profit, then you are a company first, and you must make sure that you optimize the act of making money, because that's going to determine how long you control what you do.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, how do you look at I suppose, some noises there.
Sorry.
Yeah. How do you balance? I mean, some people talk.
Wait, I don't know why there's so much sound. There's not much around me. Sorry,
it sometimes picks up weird sounds. Don't worry. People talk about mixing projects and having a for-profit with not-for-profit projects, and one funding the other and so forth. And there's also many social entrepreneurs talk about the danger of needing of moving upstream, so that the poorest segments of the community end up not being served because there are fatter margins, in other wealthier demographics and so forth. Is that not a real risk?
No, I think it's a very real risk, but I think it's a question of. I think that also happens when. I think the easiest way to resolve it is if you. So I'll give you my own example because I think it's hard to address this without specific examples. I think we obviously have fatter margins the further up market we go. But at the same time, we also have probably very, very quickly waning demand the further up market we go in terms of income. Because if our product is designed to be affordable and scale, right? Because I think if you are a social enterprise, the products we design have to be products that are affordable and are usable by many people. So we're in the low margin, high scale business. It's not easy to sell that product to someone at a much higher margin. So in many ways, I think the product you put out there will determine who buys it. I think if people, if you find yourself in a situation where it's much easier to go up market and sell it for more money, it probably means that your product is designed for that in some shape or form. And I think at that point in time, it's important to either decide that it's not interesting to make money in that segment, or live with the fact that one would work with the middle income segment for a period of time, and as the product gets cheaper, the lower income segments are going to be the bulk of the consumer base. Because I think trying to force a product that's more profitable as a business for people who can pay more downstream is just not really going to work in the marketplace. So perhaps I sound a little cynical when I say this, but I think it's just if one is finding that the product is more easily saleable to richer people and is a better business in the sense that you're also getting more scale there, then the product isn't really designed for the lower income segments.
Right, that is interesting because people talk about this idea of designing the your business to be scalable right from the beginning. I mean, have you any thoughts on that?
I think it's hard to. I think it's very hard to say when one, especially in these sorts of problems, it's very hard to say that my business will be designed to scale upfront, because I think again that's something that's gotten borrowed a lot from the technology sector, where where that's of course what one should do with a web product. But if you're delivering services, as many social entrepreneurs do, I think it's very hard to find precedent in the world where someone said, I'm starting a services startup that is going to do one thing and one thing only, and then build it so it scales to millions of people. I have rarely found an example of this. I think what tends to happen with services businesses is you build a service, you scramble and you get business the first 2 years. And then the product evolves to the point where at some stage you believe you found an answer. Because I think we I think went through this ourselves, where I think for the early phases we were very obsessed with trying to just focus on scaling one particular product. But because the product's constantly evolving, it basically becomes a choice of saying, am I going to stumble and get what business I can for the product I have and then fix the product? Or am I going to be very stubborn about saying, this is the product I'm building, this is who I'm selling it to, and stay the course? And I think that is a call each entrepreneur has to take, where the second approach is more fraught with risk, I believe. And I think we, as social entrepreneurs, we stop being fashionable pretty soon. I think 3 years, 4 years into what we're doing, it's not the most exciting thing for people to back. So it's important to realize that, it's much easier raising your first round of funding than your second and your third. So it's important to be practical when doing business and saying, I'm going to try and make this business sustainable first by whichever means are necessary. And then, get involved with scaling. Of course, I like I said, I think if the technology businesses, it's very different. But in service businesses, it's hard to design for scale up front because you don't know what your service is.
Wow, yes, excellent. You've laid that out very clearly. Oh gosh, this morning I'm just dropping all the questions. I was this question of pivoting. It's an idea which is well established now in Silicon Valley, and also ideas around the lean startup and so forth. Is there potential, do you think, for these ideas to be more widely applied in the world of social enterprise and social business? And what insights do you have about pivoting and thinking about responding and changing in time?
And I think I'm a big believer in that. I think we've seen it ourselves, which is because we didn't build a lot of scale around the first model we did, and this sort of leads back to my previous answer, which is in a service business as we are, and I think in most social businesses, I think it takes a few years to really understand what the problem is. I think when we all write our first business plans, we all feel that we've really understood, what we're trying to solve. But as we start doing it, I think it takes years to really get a good handle on what the issue is, what the problem is, and what we're really trying to do about it. So I think being able to keep yourself in a stage where you can pivot quickly is very, very important. In our own example, we had close to 100 children, about 400 volunteers in our first model. It was large, but it was not so large that it was hard for us to change what we did. So when we realized we had to start teaching and we saw good evidence to it, we were able to do that relatively easily. And because not too many people had invested too much money into the first model, they were also okay with us changing what we did. So I think keep being agile and not scaling something too much before it works, I think are very, very important and very akin to the sort of lean startup and philosophy that the Valley's used. I think startups in the Valley have used for a while.
Right, excellent. I'm nearly there. I'm mindful of the time, Akshay. It is very interesting, though, and I'm sure it'll be very helpful for other social entrepreneurs. And this is probably a difficult question to answer, but in terms of framing the way you're building your business, I mean, clearly there are a couple of things that come out of this that are really important, and one is thinking about pivoting clearly and thinking about learning, I suppose, and responding over time. And also this question of balancing, social and business, impact. So, thinking about that, it seems quite challenging in a way to you're trying to not necessarily maximize, but balance, very different kinds of priorities. What have you learned about doing that?
I think my biggest learning is to set boundaries. It's easier to set thresholds rather than constantly evaluate everything that's happening. So I think in my own mind, and my caveat here is I think this changes periodically as we learn more. But in my own mind, there's certain boundaries around what I can or cannot do with respect to the impact of my product, and there are certain things I can or cannot do around my business. So, for instance, I think there's the lower bound on the businesses. I will not do programs that or start branches of the business that lose money constantly. Right, so that's a natural bound on business.
Yes.
And there is no upper bound because you should make as much money as you can. On the social end, I think there's clearly a lower bound on saying that I will not deliver a program that's fundamentally hurtful or misleading to children. So that's a clear lower bound. I think another is that I will not have more than a certain percentage of my customer base be above a certain income level. I think and that's really sort of the two bounds, three bounds we set ourselves, and unless we feel that we are transgressing on those bounds, we can pretty much do whatever we like, and it's easier to deal with that than constantly have to, evaluate and reevaluate what one is doing, because that's really, really stressful.
That's very interesting. Is that something that you've just evolved yourself, or is it something you've seen established elsewhere?
It's been hard to find precedents because there's a very small community of for-profit social businesses, and most of them are very young. So I think this is something which we've had to evolve for ourselves through talking with many people who are in the same boat as us. And I know of most for-profit businesses I know in the social space. I think tend to do something similar, where it's easier to communicate boundaries to employees throughout the organization than try and constantly have this debate and evaluative process going on.
Right. That's very interesting. And then, what clearly, the business is going very well. There are obviously days which are difficult days, and there are moments where things, certainly in the early stages, don't seem to be working out. What keeps you going when things are difficult?
I think it's the possibility of what it could be. Right? It's the optimism. I think in many ways, where I think most of what we hear or the feedback we get is often negative, right? Because when you're a young startup, I would say 9 out of 10 things we try don't work, or don't at least don't work as well as we thought they would work. So I think the thing that keeps most of us going is really just the fact that in the 1 in 10 chance that it really does work, it's so exciting that we're constantly somehow searching for that moment of of clarity or joy. So I think it is optimism, and I think the other part is also that we do see when we do see outcomes, it's important to keep reminding oneself of the successes we've had to date, because I think we have helped a lot of children, and I think it's each time we're kind of down, thinking back to the kids we actually made a difference for is again reassuring and helpful.
Right. You touched on a topic there, and this is the last question, is about failure and attitude to failure. A little bit comes from that. How important is that for, everyone says in for entrepreneurship and for business, cultures of embracing failure and learning, fast and so forth. Do you think, are social entrepreneurs good at this, and how do you need to frame that in a way that's useful so that you can actually, innovate?
I think I can't make a general comment on social entrepreneurs. I don't think I know enough of them to do that. But I do think that I think it's important to recognize that we will fail. Like the odds are against us, right? In terms of what we do, 1 in 10 startups, like for-profit startups, succeed, and they're often solving less difficult problems than we are. So at the onset, we've signed up for a task that we are more than likely to fail at. So the only reason we should be doing what we're doing is in search of that 1 in 20, 1 in 30 chance that we actually fundamentally transform the world. So as long as we're cognizant of the fact that those were our odds when we started, and anything which puts our odds at less than 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 is actually good news. It's easy to stay a little bit more cheerful about where we are.
That's been fascinating, Akshay. It's been very interesting to learn firsthand from your experience, and Avanti seems to be doing great work, and I wish you the very best of success.
Thanks so much, Fergal.
Thank you for listening to the Inspiring Social Entrepreneur podcast. I hope you found this interview inspiring. Please make sure to visit www.inspiringsocialentrepreneurs.com and subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future podcasts. Yes, absolutely.